everyone, and welcome back to Tea Time Thoughts. I'm Kaylin, as always, and today, while I drink a cup of, I don't know which berries in particular, it's just a berry blend, but berry blend tea, I'm going to talk to you guys about the Voyages of Zheng He. And as I said before in the last episode, it's something that I find very fascinating, so this should be a fun episode. So I'm going to start off first by providing the background for our main character today, Zheng He. So we are going back all the way to the Ming Dynasty of China. So the Ming Dynasty lasted from 1368 to 1644, and it followed the Yuan Mongol dynasty, and it was founded by Zhu Yongzhang, and it was formed when the Yuan dynasty was struggling with rebellions in the state during the 14th century. And during this time, a young orphan named Zhu Wanzhang was taken to a Buddhist monastery, which was later destroyed by Mongolian troops. He then joined a religious movement against the Mongols called the Red Turbans, and he showed talent in the army and was eventually established as the new Chinese Ming Dynasty leader. So as a result of the high amount of soldiers due to the movements against the Mongols, a new hierarchy was formed which placed soldiers at the top of the social ladder. And under the rule of Zhu, who was then renamed Hongwu, the empire would expand from the Gobi Desert to Manchuria in the south. And this is significant because the Ming Dynasty is considered one of the greatest eras of orderly government and stability in history. And the Ming Dynasty is not only noted for its stability, but also its autocracy. And it had a great impact on the history of Chinese politics because its governmental structure was carried on by the Qing Dynasty and was actually used up until the early 20th century. So in order to work in a governmental capacity in the Ming Dynasty, one had to pass a government examination, and this exam was incredibly difficult. It was only limited to young men, and you had to know the ins and outs of Confucianism, law, and more, and only the best of the best passed. And those who did pass went on to receive government positions. And this is worth bearing in mind because it shows that there's an emphasis on meritocracy or skill rather than inheriting a position. And this emphasis on merit is going to end up being what will allow Zheng He to succeed in the ways that he did. So many of the emperors during this time relied on court eunuchs that would serve the emperor in some sort of capacity, and they would ultimately help an emperor maintain control of the state, which is very important because during this time there are some conflicts that take place during the Ming Dynasty, such as clashes with the Mongols and some naval conflicts with Japan. And now that we've set the scene for today, we can dig into our protagonist, Zheng He. So Zheng He was born in 1371 into a Chinese Muslim family, and he was originally named Ma Sanbao, or Ma He. And his father was a Haji, or one who had made a pilgrimage to Mecca. And what's interesting is that the family name Ma has its roots in a Chinese rendition of the name Muhammad. So we have this tie between Ma He and his Islamic heritage. And his family had lived in the last Mongol foothold of Yunnan. Ma He had a good education in his childhood, considering that he studied the likes of Confucius and Mencius, and he was very curious about the world and traveling after hearing stories about his father's trip to Mecca. However, in 1381, Yunnan was taken over by Chinese generals, and Ma was captured along with several other children by the Ming forces and was castrated and brought to serve as a eunuch in the Ming court. And one thing that's interesting to bear in mind is a lot of the reports that I read about Ma He's stature, he was said to be incredibly tall and very stout and strong as well, which is something that you wouldn't typically see with a young boy who had been castrated because it affects the puberty process. Usually they don't grow up to be very tall and muscular, but this wasn't the case for Ma He. Now, it would be easy to assume that Ma He wouldn't want to work for the people that had captured him, but he very quickly gained a reputation for being somebody who was hardworking and diligent, and this led him to be noticed by the Prince of Yan, Zhe Di, who would eventually go on to become the Yongle Emperor. Ma He received military training and served in some military campaigns against the Mongols, and then in 1402, Ma He helped Zhu Di overthrow his nephew, the current emperor Zhu Yunwen, and in return, Zhu Di gave Ma He the name Zheng He and promoted him to the position of Grand Director of Directorate of Palace Servants, quite the long title, and later Zheng He would become the chief envoy for Zhu Di's commissioned sea voyages. Now, from 1402 to about 1433, Zheng He would conduct 7 voyages on behalf of the emperor in which he would travel the world through the Pacific and Indian Oceans. His first voyage took place in 1405, in which he oversaw a fleet of 317 ships, including 62 treasure ships, and overall his fleet consisted of about 28,000 men. Now, these weren't small ships either. These were incredibly massive ships. Like, some descriptions say that they were the size of football fields, and When you compare his ships to the size of Christopher Columbus's ships, 60 to 90 years ahead of them, they completely dwarf Columbus's ships. They're at least 4 times the size of Columbus's biggest ship. Now, you might be thinking, well, what's the purpose of these voyages? Why do you need these massive ships? What are all these thousands of crew members doing? So the purpose of these expeditions have been somewhat debated, but it's generally thought that they were meant to establish Chinese control over trade in the Indian Ocean, expand China's tributary system, in which they would collect tributes such as money or other valuable items from different territories, and overall to impress and possibly intimidate people throughout the world by showing off China's power and wealth. So on their first expedition, Zheng He visited Champa, which is now in southern Vietnam, as well as Siam, Malacca, Java, Calicut, and Ceylon before returning to China 2 years later, in 1407. On this expedition, Zheng He was able to share his diplomatic skills, and he ended up collecting a great deal of wealth. He ended up collecting a great deal of wealth and luxurious items. He also ended up sharing a variety of Chinese goods in the territories that he visited to give them an idea not only of China's vast power, but also their wealth. And the exchange of these goods was also something of a diplomatic service as well. Zheng He's second voyage took place in 1408 and lasted until 1409. And this particular voyage was significant because they actually intervened in a conflict between China and Java. In 1407, the Western King of Java said that he had mistakenly sentenced 170 Ming troops to death after they had come to Java to trade. In exchange, the Ming court demanded a payment of gold and said that if the Javanese king didn't comply with the tribute demands, then they would send an army out to them. So the King of Java did eventually pay this, and the Ming Dynasty would be able to utilize future voyages to ensure the peace between the two nations, as well as to collect tributes. Zheng He, after the second voyage completed, embarked on a third that lasted a bit longer, from about 1409 to 1411. And on this particular voyage, he visited some of the places that he had been to before and was therefore able to return to collect tributes. They also traveled to the Malay Peninsula, and here they actually did experience some conflict with the King of Ceylon, who planned a surprise attack on their fleet. In response, Zheng He and his men captured the capital of Ceylon and captured the Ceylonese royal family and several other significant figures from the court. Zheng He and his crew then took the captives to the court of the Ming Emperor and presented them to him. The emperor then decreed for them to be set free and allowed them to return to their home country. Then they placed one of their allies on the throne in Ceylon instead. However, it was Zheng He's fourth mission that left in 1413 that would prove to be one of the most impressive. In addition to all their previous stops, they also visited the Maldives and Laccadive Islands as well as the Persian Gulf. During this particular voyage, they made some headway in trading by trading various luxury goods like silks and spices. And on his return to China in 1415, he brought back a variety of envoys, diplomats, and representatives from the countries they had visited. It was during this trip that they also captured the king of Sumatra, who had been accused of usurping the throne from his family member, who had been the previous king. Zheng He and his men, after they captured the king, brought him back to the Ming emperor before the usurper king was then executed. Then, during Zheng He's fifth voyage from 1417 to 1419, they traveled to the likes of Arabia and Eastern Africa. They also made a stop at Changzhou, where they loaded up on porcelain, and we know that they stopped at this particular place because we actually have a Ming Dynasty tablet left here that marks this journey. And this tablet also matches with other tablets that were placed on the ships during the time, which would make tributes to various gods that the voyagers would hope to bless the journey. And it's interesting because these tablets provide great records for us to look back on and better understand Zheng He and his men and their expeditions. It's also thought that on this particular voyage that they encountered a giraffe, and thinking that it was a creature from Chinese mythology known as the qilin, brought it back to China along with several other impressive animals such as zebras, ostriches, rhinoceros, and more. And of course, this wasn't the only expedition in which they brought back animals, but the story of the giraffe is considered one of the most famous instances of this, because we do kind of take it for granted knowing what all these different animals are because the world is so easily accessible to us. But seeing these particular instances of people just being wowed by something that seemed commonplace to us is really sort of humbling. And it reminds me a bit of Marco Polo's description of seeing a rhinoceros, except he thought it was a unicorn, and he was just dismayed by how ugly this thing was. To him, it made sense that it was a unicorn because it has that singular horn, and a unicorn also is, fabled as having that horn, but it's so interesting to see these perceptions of different animals and how people relate them to their own cultures and their own beliefs. So then, on the 6th expedition, Zheng He and his crew left in 1421, and in this trip, Zheng He was sent off with a variety of imperial letters and goods to offer at their different stops, such as silks and gauzes, and this trip would also act as more of a diplomatic return mission, so a variety of foreign envoys could return back to their home countries after visiting Ming Dynasty China. And after this, the voyages were temporarily stopped in order to fund the Ming Dynasty's campaign against the Mongols that were still going on during this time. And we see this because there's a several-year gap in between the 6th expedition and the 7th and final expedition. So the 7th and final expedition took place from 1431 to 1433, and their furthest destination west was Hormuz, and the majority of the voyage ultimately took place throughout southern and central Asia, as well as the Middle East. And it's also speculated that either during this voyage or shortly after, that Admiral Zheng He died at sea in 1433. Some people have also speculated that he might have died during a military campaign in 1435, but for the most part, it's accepted that he died at sea during his 7th exploration. And it's then after the year of 1433 that these voyages come to an end, and the Ming Dynasty turns its focus away from naval and international endeavors. Now, the trades established by these voyages still continued for a while, but the imperial tributary system would eventually fall out. And as I mentioned before, why exactly these voyages ended has been a subject of heavy debate. The voyages weren't unaffordable for the dynasty. Even though they were a great expense, they were ultimately very profitable, so it wasn't a financial issue, and there was room in the Ming treasury for these expeditions. Some say that this has to do with the disapproval of court eunuchs being in positions of power, while others say it has to do with turning a focus to more centralized trade in the Chinese empire. Some people say that they wanted to save their money for campaigns against the Mongols, but whatever the reason, it's clear to see that these voyages were ultimately very impressive and did ultimately prove the power of the Chinese empire. These weren't voyages with the purpose of plundering and overpowering like a lot of Western voyages, but they were rather voyages of diplomacy and trade. However, some suspect that if China had embarked on these voyages with the purpose of taking over territories and establishing dominance, then the narrative of history could have been completely different. The Chinese Empire might have had the success of the likes of the British and Roman empires. However, the political attitude in China did ultimately change a great deal after the death of Zheng He. The Ming Dynasty experienced a great deal of hardship during the later decades of the 15th century, including natural disasters such as floods and famines and other storms, as well as military disasters such as raids from the Mongols. In fact, in 1477, when someone suggested another voyage like Zheng He's voyages, the vice president of the Ministry of War confiscated all of Zheng He's records and claimed that they were too wasteful and offered no benefit to the state. Then, in 1525, the Chinese government ordered that all ocean-going ships should be destroyed, and the famous navy of the Ming Dynasty was no more. However, the legacy of Zheng He survives not only to remind us of the power of the Eastern world in a history that's very often dominated by Western civilizations, but also how close the Chinese Empire came to completely turning history on its head. All right, and that is it for today. I know that was a bit of a shorter episode, but it was still something that I found very interesting to research. I listened to a lot of podcasts during my commute this week, and I was very fascinated to dig into something that I haven't really looked into or studied since I went to school, and I just hope you guys enjoyed this as much as I did. So if you liked this episode, please feel free to like, comment, subscribe. Every platform is a little bit different, so do what works for you. If you would like to hear more from me, you can follow me on my social media channels at Tea Time Thoughts Podcast on YouTube and Instagram. You can also check me out on TikTok at Tea Time Thoughts, where I've been kind of developing a little bit more of a following and just sort of digging into some historical jokes and things like that. It's a fun way to... there are people being loud outside. Hopefully you can't hear that, but it's a fun way to dig into learning some more historical facts without needing a whole lot of background or context to it. So it's something I truly think you guys will enjoy. And don't forget to tune in next week when I talk about the Hollywood Code. It's specifically going to lean more towards American cinema, but this was something I studied in one of my classes a while back, and it's honestly so fascinating. You would be surprised how many film restrictions there were during the days of old Hollywood. And with that being said, thanks again for listening. This is Tea Time Thoughts, and I'll talk to you next time.